Cast out by her own blood and left with just loose change in her pocket, a desperate woman purchased a condemned collapsing cave for $1. She only wanted a place to sleep out of the rain. Instead, she unearthed a buried secret that would bring a powerful dynasty to its knees. The rain fell in unrelenting sheets against the frosted windows of the Oakhaven County Courthouse, mirroring the absolute ruin of Beatrice Caldwell's life. At 31, Beatrice had just been erased from her own family history. Her father, Harrison Caldwell Sr., a man whose real estate empire effectively owned half the state, had passed away 3 weeks prior. For Beatrice, the grief of losing her only loving parent was immediately eclipsed by a betrayal so sharp it left her breathless. In the mahogany-paneled office of the family attorney, just days before, her older brother Nathaniel and her stepmother Victoria had unveiled a newly revised will. It was a document allegedly signed in her father's final delirious days. Nathaniel, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than Beatrice made in a year as a middle school art teacher, had sneered as the lawyer read the terms. The sprawling Caldwell estate, the offshore accounts, the historic manor, all of it was left to Nathaniel and Victoria. Beatrice was left with a deliberately insulting inheritance, the legal responsibility for a series of obscure defaulted debts tied to a defunct subsidiary company amounting to nearly $40,000. She was given 48 hours to vacate her childhood home. Now standing in the back row of a municipal tax auction, Beatrice had exactly $42 to her name. Her battered Honda Civic, parked illegally 3 blocks away, contained everything she owned: 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of art supplies, and a sleeping bag. She was homeless, ostracized by the wealthy elite of Oakhaven, who blindly followed Nathaniel's vicious rumors that Beatrice had tried to steal from her dying father. The auctioneer, a weary man named Jonathan Miller, droned on through the list of foreclosed properties. Next up, Lot 77, a 0.2-acre parcel on the edge of the Millers Creek Ravine. Known locally as the Widow's Mouth, the property is condemned by the county due to severe geological instability. It is essentially a collapsed limestone cave with 0 residential or commercial zoning permits. The county assumes no liability for injury or death on the premises. A low chuckle rippled through the half-empty room. The Widow's Mouth was a local joke, a treacherous sinkhole filled with overgrown briars, wild dogs, and jagged rocks. The county had been trying to offload the liability for a decade. "Starting bid is $100, Jonathan announced, not even bothering to look up from his clipboard. Silence. $50. Silence. Jonathan sighed, adjusting his glasses. The county will accept a minimum administrative bid of $1 single just to transfer the deed and clear the ledger. Do I hear $1? Beatrice stared at her scuffed boots. She had spent the last 2 nights sleeping in her car in a supermarket parking lot, terrified of the security guards who tapped on her windows. She needed somewhere to park, somewhere no one would look for her. Somewhere that was hers, even if it was a literal hole in the earth. Slowly her trembling hand raised into the air. Heads turned. Whispers erupted in the courtroom. Nathaniel's former country club associates recognized her, their eyes wide with a mixture of pity and morbid amusement. The heir to the Caldwell fortune was buying the town dump for $1. "Sold for $1 to the lady in the back," Jonathan said, slamming his gavel with a sound that felt entirely too final. By nightfall, Beatrice was navigating the treacherous, muddy logging road that led to Lot 77. The headlights of her Civic cut through the dense Appalachian fog, illuminating a landscape that looked hostile and forgotten. When she finally reached the end of the passable dirt path, she killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Grabbing a heavy-duty flashlight from her glove box, she stepped out into the freezing drizzle. The property was exactly as described, a steep, terrifying drop-off, shrouded in twisted oak trees, leading down to a massive, jagged fissure in the limestone cliff face. It looked like the earth had simply opened its jaws. She carefully picked her way down the slope, slipping on wet leaves and loose shale. Her goal was just to find a relatively flat overhang near the cave entrance where she could pitch a cheap tarp and sit out the storm. As she reached the mouth of the cave, the smell of damp earth and deep, ancient cold washed over her. She huddled beneath a rocky outcropping, wrapping her sleeping bag tightly around her shoulders. The rain intensified, causing miniature mudslides along the walls of the ravine. Beatrice closed her eyes, the tears finally coming. She wept for her father, for her stolen future, and for the sheer terrifying reality of her survival. Suddenly a loud grinding crack echoed through the darkness, followed by the heavy thud of collapsing earth. Beatrice scrambled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She shined her flashlight toward the back of the shallow cave entrance. The heavy rainfall had caused a massive section of the interior mud wall to cave in. But it wasn't just rocks and dirt that had fallen. Protruding from the freshly collapsed earth was something entirely unnatural. It was metallic. Beatrice crept closer, wiping the rain from her eyes. Half buried in a century of sediment exposed by the storm was a massive reinforced steel door. It was riveted, rusted at the edges, and looked exactly like the door of a bank vault. And in the center of the heavy steel, barely visible beneath a layer of grime, was an insignia engraved deeply into the metal, a serpent coiled around a compass. It was the ancestral crest of the Caldwell family. For a long time, Beatrice simply stared at the tarnished crest, her mind struggling to bridge the gap between impossible reality and feverish hallucination. Why was her family's crest a symbol plastered on the gates of Nathaniel's stolen mansion, bolted to a subterranean vault in a condemned ravine? She reached out her fingers, tracing the cold, raised edges of the serpent. The metal was freezing, radiating a chill that seemed to seep straight into her bones. The door was set into a frame of poured concrete, expertly disguised to blend in with the natural limestone before the mudslide had exposed it. There was a heavy wheel in the center, encrusted with decades of rust and mineral deposits. Desperation breeds a unique kind of strength. Beatrice wrapped both hands around the iron wheel and pulled with all her might. It didn't budge a millimeter. It was fused shut by time and the elements. She needed tools. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, biting chill. Beatrice drove back into town, avoiding the affluent neighborhoods. She went straight to a local pawn shop on the outskirts of Oakhaven, operated by a grumpy, chain-smoking man named Desmond. She pawned her mother's silver locket, the only piece of jewelry Nathaniel hadn't managed to confiscate, for a heartbreakingly low sum of $200. With the cash, she headed to a hardware store. She bought a heavy sledgehammer, a crowbar, industrial strength, rust-penetrant, thick leather gloves, and 3 high-powered LED lanterns. By noon, she was back at the widow's mouth. For 4 grueling hours, Beatrice waged war against the steel door. She soaked the mechanism in chemicals, hammering the wheel repeatedly to break the rust seal. Her hands blistered, her muscles screamed in agony. She was fueled by an intoxicating mix of anger and adrenaline. Nathaniel had taken everything from her, but this secret buried in the dirt belonged to her by the ultimate legal irony. She had the deed. With one final screaming heave on the crowbar wedged into the wheel's spokes, a loud crack echoed through the cavern. The wheel groaned, resisting for a fraction of a second before slowly grinding counterclockwise. Beatrice fell back into the mud, gasping for air. She scrambled back to her feet, grabbed the handle and pulled. The heavy steel door groaned on its hinges, resisting the intrusion before swinging outward with a rush of stale, incredibly dry air. The scent was distinct dust, old paper, and a faint metallic tang. Clicking on her high-powered lanterns, Beatrice stepped over the threshold. She expected a dark, natural cave. What she found made her drop her crowbar in sheer disbelief. She was standing in a long, man-made corridor, lined with immaculate red brick. Edison-style glass bulbs hung from the ceiling by thick, fabric-wrapped wires. The floor was laid with intricate black and white mosaic tiles, completely untouched by the dampness outside. It was a perfectly preserved relic of the 1920s. Beatrice walked slowly down the corridor, her footsteps echoing in the absolute silence. At the end of the hall, the space opened up into a massive circular chamber. It was a subterranean speakeasy, but unlike any historical photo she had ever seen. The room was opulent, velvet armchairs remarkably preserved in the dry, climate-controlled environment, surrounded mahogany card tables. But the most shocking element was the far wall. It was lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of brass safety deposit boxes, exactly like a high-end bank. In the center of the room sat a massive oak desk. On top of it lay a thick, leather-bound ledger, a brass fountain pen resting beside it, as if the writer had merely stepped out for a cigarette and never returned. Beatrice approached the desk, her hands trembling as she opened the heavy ledger. The paper was crisp, the ink a faded sepia. The first page bore a heading written in an elegant, sweeping script: The Oakhaven Trust. Established 1929. Off-book assets and appropriations. She began to turn the pages. Her eyes widened as she read the names. They were the founding fathers of the town: the mayor, the chief of police, the local judge. And there, listed at the top with the largest deposits, was her great-grandfather, Silas Caldwell. But these weren't standard banking records. Next to every name were detailed notes of extortion, illegal bootlegging profits, and stolen municipal funds. It was a master ledger of systemic corruption. The wealth that built Oakhaven, the fortune that her brother Nathaniel was currently using to destroy her, was built entirely on a massive, bloody criminal syndicate. Well, 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 look what the rat dragged out of the trash. Beatrice spun around her heart, leaping into her throat. Standing in the doorway of the chamber was a man she recognized instantly. It was Leonard Vance, no wait, it was Donovan Finch. He was Nathaniel's ruthless fix-it attorney, a man known for making people disappear through endless litigation, or worse. He was holding a high-powered flashlight and a very sharp, very predatory smile. Nathaniel thought it was suspicious that you actually bought this worthless piece of dirt, Donovan said, stepping into the room and whistling low as he looked around at the pristine 1920s architecture. He sent me down here to offer you $500 for the deed, just a generous gift to help you leave state. But seeing this, Donovan's eyes locked onto the wall of brass safety deposit boxes glittering in the lantern light. Greed flashed across his face. I think the price just went down to zero, Beatrice, he said, smoothly taking a step toward her. You are trespassing on Caldwell family history. Hand over the ledger. Beatrice clutched the heavy book to her chest, her mind racing. She was alone underground with a man who would gladly bury her to protect Nathaniel's empire. But she was no longer the broken woman crying in her car. She was standing in the vault of her ancestors, holding the weapon that could destroy them all. Beatrice's knuckles turned white as she gripped the leather-bound ledger. The heavy silence of the subterranean vault was broken only by the slow, deliberate echoing of Donovan Finch's leather wingtip shoes against the immaculate mosaic tiles. The attorney's eyes darted from the book in her hands to the hundreds of brass safety deposit boxes lining the curved brick wall. He was a man who understood leverage, and the sheer volume of blackmail material surrounding them was practically intoxicating to him. You have absolutely no idea what you are holding, Beatrice, Donovan said, his voice dropping into a smooth, placating rhythm, the same tone he used when dismantling hostile witnesses on the stand. That ledger belongs to the Caldwell estate. Nathaniel is the sole executor. Ergo, you are holding stolen property. Now be a good girl and hand it over before I have to call the county sheriff and have you arrested for burglary. I bought this land at a county auction, Donovan. Beatrice replied, her voice trembling, but gaining strength with every syllable. Lot 77. I own the deed. That means everything on it, and everything beneath it belongs to me. This isn't Nathaniel's property anymore. Donovan laughed, a sharp barking sound, devoid of any real humor. Oh, the deed. You think a piece of paper from a municipal tax sale supersedes a century of Caldwell dominance. Nathaniel owns the judges in Oakhaven. He owns the police chief. If I walk out of here with that book, there will be no record of this place ever existing. And as for you, well, the widow's mouth has always been dangerous. Tragic accidents happen to desperate, homeless women all the time. He lunged forward, moving with a sudden, vicious speed that betrayed his manicured appearance. Beatrice scrambled backward, her hip crashing into the massive oak desk. She swung the heavy ledger wildly, catching Donovan on the shoulder, but the attorney barely flinched. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin like iron talons, trying to pry the book from her grasp. In the chaotic struggle, Beatrice's foot knocked against the heavy steel crowbar she had dropped earlier. It rolled across the mosaic floor with a loud clang. Donovan's eyes flicked toward the noise for a fraction of a second, a fatal mistake. Using her free hand, Beatrice grabbed the brass fountain pen resting on the desk and drove the sharp nib directly into the back of Donovan's hand. He roared in pain, releasing his grip and stumbling backward. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She lunged for the crowbar, her fingers wrapping around the cold iron, and swung it in a wide arc, smashing it directly into the nearest high-powered LED lantern she had brought down. The lantern shattered, plunging half the room into thick, disorienting shadows. "You little wretch!" Donovan snarled, pulling the pen from his hand and flicking blood onto the floor. He drew a small, snub-nosed revolver from his tailored suit jacket, leveling it in the dim light. "Playtime is over. Put the book on the desk and step back." Beatrice backed away, her mind racing. She realized she couldn't outfight a man with a gun. She slowly lowered the ledger onto the desk, raising her hands. Donovan smirked, stepping forward to claim his prize. But Beatrice's eyes were not on the book. They were on the wall of safety deposit boxes, directly behind the desk. During their struggle, the heavy ledger had snagged on a small, protruding brass key, left absent-mindedly in one of the central boxes decades ago. It had twisted just enough to pop the narrow metal door slightly ajar. As Donovan reached for the ledger, his gaze locked greedily on the pages. Beatrice dove to the side, dropping behind the massive oak desk. She grabbed the edge of the open safety deposit box and yanked the internal steel tray out. Inside the tray were bundles of cash, ancient large-face $100 bills, but beneath them lay a stack of heavy parchment documents, bound by a brittle red ribbon. Beatrice grabbed the documents, stuffing them down the front of her jacket. "Hey!" Donovan shouted, raising the revolver. Beatrice kicked the heavy oak desk with both feet, sending it sliding a few inches across the polished floor, knocking Donovan off balance. Before he could recover his aim, she bolted down the long, brick-lined corridor, the shadows swallowing her. "You can't run, Beatrice," Donovan's voice echoed down the hall, followed by the deafening, concussive bang of a gunshot. The bullet shattered a vintage Edison bulb above her head, showering her with glass. But she didn't stop. She reached the heavy steel vault door. Outside, the freezing night air of the ravine rushed in to meet her. She slipped through the opening, her boots hitting the muddy, treacherous incline of the cave entrance. Donovan's heavy footsteps pounded down the corridor. He was faster on the flat tile. Beatrice knew she couldn't outrun him in the mud. She turned, grabbing the massive rusted iron wheel on the outside of the vault door. With every ounce of strength she possessed, fueled by sheer, unadulterated survival instinct, she shoved the massive steel slab. The hinges screamed in protest. Donovan reached the threshold, just as the door began to close, his eyes widening in terror as he realized her plan. He threw his weight against the inside of the door, but the angle and the immense weight of the steel were against him. Beatrice jammed the crowbar into the outer locking mechanism and threw her entire body weight against it. The vault door slammed shut with a reverberating boom that shook dirt from the cavern ceiling. Beatrice furiously spun the outer locking wheel, the rusted tumblers grinding into place with a definitive heavy clunk. Donovan was trapped inside the climate-controlled tomb of his own greed. She could hear his muffled shouts and the dull thud of his fists beating against the impenetrable steel, but it was useless. The vault had been designed to keep the federal government out in the 1920s. It would certainly keep a corrupt lawyer in. Gasping for breath, her hands bleeding and covered in ancient mud, Beatrice pulled the brittle parchment documents from her jacket. She clicked on her remaining battered flashlight. They were original land patents and master lease agreements, completely circumventing the current county records, and they were all made out to a specific holding company, a holding company whose obscure, defaulted debts Beatrice had just been legally forced to inherit by her brother. The dawn broke over Oakhaven County with a crisp, indifferent clarity, but for Nathaniel Caldwell, the morning was nothing short of glorious. Sitting at the head of the massive glass-walled conference room in the Caldwell Tower downtown, Nathaniel adjusted his silk tie. Today was the crowning achievement of his career. He was about to sign a multi-million-dollar urban redevelopment contract with an international conglomerate, effectively selling off the historic downtown district to build luxury high-rises. His stepmother, Victoria, sat beside him, sipping espresso and wearing a smug expression. Beatrice had vanished, presumably running off to some squalid neighboring state with her measly $40. The family legacy was entirely theirs. "If everyone is ready," Nathaniel said, uncapping his solid gold pen, "let's finalize this transfer." Before the executives across the table could nod, the heavy double doors of the conference room swung open. A profound silence fell over the room as Beatrice walked in. She was a stark contrast to the polished executives. She wore a borrowed, ill-fitting blazer, her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and a small white bandage covered a scrape on her cheek. But her posture was perfectly straight, and her eyes burned with an icy, terrifying authority. Flanking her were three men in dark suits, their lapels adorned with the subtle gold pins of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, led by Special Agent John Henderson, a man whose jurisdiction fell far outside the corrupt reach of Oakhaven's local judges. "Beatrice." Nathaniel stood up, his face flushing with immediate rage. "What is the meaning of this security? How did she get up here?" "Security has been temporarily relieved of their duties," Mr. Caldwell, Agent Henderson said, stepping forward. He flashed a federal warrant. "We are here executing a seizure of assets, pending a federal racketeering and fraud investigation." Victoria dropped her espresso cup, the porcelain shattering against the hardwood floor. "Fraud, Nathaniel, what is he talking about?" Beatrice walked slowly to the head of the table. She reached into a leather satchel and pulled out copies of the brittle parchment documents she had salvaged from the vault, tossing them onto the polished mahogany. "You should have looked closer at the debt you saddled me with, Nathaniel," Beatrice said, her voice echoing clearly in the stunned room. "When you forced me to take on the liabilities of the Oakhaven Industrial Development Corporation, you assumed it was a dead shell company filled with $40,000 of unpaid administrative taxes." Nathaniel's eyes darted to the documents, his face draining of color. "It is a dead company. It hasn't operated since 1931. Exactly. Beatrice smiled a sharp, dangerous expression. But what you failed to realize, and what your fix-it lawyer Donovan Finch couldn't tell you, because he is currently awaiting extraction from a subterranean speakeasy by federal engineers, is that Oakhaven Industrial Development wasn't just a shell. It was the master holding company used by our great-grandfather. She tapped the parchment. These are the original 99-year ground leases for the entire downtown commercial district, including the land sitting directly beneath this very tower. The county records were doctored in the 40s to hide the syndicate's assets, but federal law recognizes the original patents holding the continuous chain of title. And as the sole legal owner of Oakhaven Industrial Development, Beatrice leaned over the table, looking directly into her brother's terrified eyes. I own the dirt under your feet, Nathaniel. I am your landlord, and you are 85 years behind on rent. Chaos erupted in the boardroom. The international executives immediately began packing their briefcases, barking orders at their legal counsel. Nathaniel stumbled backward, stammering, trying to articulate a defense, but Agent Henderson was already moving forward, reciting his Miranda rights. The ensuing months were a whirlwind of federal indictments that rocked the state to its core. The ledger Beatrice recovered exposed a century of generational corruption. The local judges, the police chief, and several city council members were arrested. Nathaniel and Victoria faced decades in federal prison for fraud extortion and attempting to forge Harrison Caldwell Sr.'s will. The irony of Nathaniel's downfall became the stuff of national legend. In his greed to leave his sister with absolute ruin, he had legally transferred the actual ownership of the Caldwell empire into her hands. Beatrice did not keep the stolen empire. With the help of state regulators, she dissolved the corrupt leases, transferring the land back to the city to be placed in a public trust. She kept only enough of the recovered legitimate funds to rebuild her life on her own terms. She opened a massive community arts center in the heart of downtown Oakhaven, a sanctuary for children who felt lost, abandoned, or discarded by the world. And occasionally, on quiet, rainy afternoons, she would sit by the window of her new office, looking out at the city she had accidentally conquered with a single desperate dollar, knowing that true worth is never found in what you are given, but in what you are willing to unearth. What an incredible journey. Beatrice's story proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the places we are told are entirely worthless, and that karma has a beautiful way of balancing the scales. Have you ever discovered something amazing in a forgotten place? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this thrilling, real-life tale of betrayal, hidden vaults, and ultimate justice, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more amazing stories.